We now turn to the inductive arguments part of argument basics. Inductive arguments are, not surprisingly, arguments. So each inductive argument consists of one conclusion and one or more premises. By definition, an inductive argument is an argument in which the premises are intended to provide some degree of support, but less than complete support for the conclusion. The premises, to put it another way, are offered as evidence the conclusion is likely or probably true. Why does it have this feature? Well, in inductive arguments, the conclusion goes beyond the evidence presented in the premises. This is known as the inductive leap. And this is why they don't offer certainty, because when you make an inductive argument, you're going from evidence that you know what you've observed to something beyond that, something you've not observed. To use a simple example, this is, when this is being recorded, this is political season because we have the upcoming 2020 election. And as you might imagine, news and pundits and so forth are very interested in polls and surveys. And suppose we have a survey that surveys a certain number of people, and they give a result that, say, 60% of the population surveyed are going to vote for, candidate A. Well, when we make the inference that because 60% of those surveyed will vote for candidate A, that they will actually vote for candidate A, leap to that conclusion, we're going from what we've observed, the people we've surveyed or sampled, to something beyond that. Which is why inductive arguments can always go bad, because you're making this leap. As another example, people often buy based on brand experience. So suppose you've had, for example, an iPhone for quite some time, and all the previous ones have been good. And what you might do is say, well, when the next one comes out, that you'll buy that one because your previous ones have been good. But you're making a leap because you're going from what you've observed, your previous phones, to the new one. And the new one is likely to be good, but since you're making a leap, it could be terrible. So how do you tell when you've got a good inductive argument? Well, inductive arguments are assessed in terms of how strongly the premises support the conclusion. They're assessed in this way by using standards specific to the type of argument. So unlike deductive arguments, where you use general methods like like a proof, or in the case of true functional logic, truth tables, in the case of categorical logic, Venn diagrams, where you can test, say, any truth functional logic argument with the truth table. With inductive arguments, you have a set of standards you apply to that argument to see whether it's strong or weak. And so unlike deductive arguments, there are no perfectly objective and definitive ways of assessing an inductive argument to show that objectively and without doubt it is, say, strong or weak, because the standards can be subject to debate. This is not to say that the standards are arbitrary or utterly subjective. It's just that they're not as decisive as testing for validity versus invalidity. So what is this strong and weak stuff? Well, a strong inductive argument is an argument such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is likely to be true, given those premises. A weak argument is an argument such that even if the premises are true, the conclusion is not likely to be true. Now, unlike validity, which is absolute, a deductive argument is valid or invalid, inductive arguments, their strength, is relative. So you can talk about inductive arguments being stronger or weaker than each other, and the strength of an argument, of course, comes in degrees. So it's not just simply a binary strong-weak. There are degrees of strength and degrees of weakness. Now, in some cases, we can actually have a numerical measure of how strong the argument is. For example, if we have, the eye color argument, suppose premise 1, suppose it's true that 80% of all humans have brown eyes. Premise 2, suppose it's true that Sally is human. Then the conclusion would be Sally has brown eyes. And that would be a strong argument, because if the premises are all true, that 80% of all humans have brown eyes and that Sally is human, then we have a 80% chance of being right. We could be wrong, but we're more likely to be right. Now, of course, you could have a pretty weak argument if you kind of change the eye color thing. If you said 80% of humans have brown eyes, Sally is human, Sally does not have brown eyes, in which case you're only 20% chance of being right, so that would be a weak argument. In other cases, we don't have exact numerical measures where we just kind of do a estimate. For example, if we go back to the example with the iPhone, suppose you've owned, say 3 versions of the iPhone, and the new one comes out and you say, my 3 previous ones have been good, I'll buy the next one, it'll be good too. We don't have an exact mathematical calculation of exactly how likely it is it'll be good, but you'd assess it based on, how has Apple done with the phones, in the past. You'd also consider such factors as, how is Apple doing now, etc. You wouldn't be able to assign an exact probability, but you could say the argument is, say, strong or weak based on, how well the premises support that conclusion. So, recap on inductive arguments. They're all arguments, of course, so each one has one conclusion and multiple premises, possibly, at least one. And they offer a degree of support. So a strong inductive argument is such that if all the premises were true, the conclusion is likely to be true. A weak one is such that even if all the premises are true, the conclusion is not likely to be true. And this strength and weakness comes in degrees, and deciding if it's strong enough or weak enough can often be a very practical matter. For example, if one is making an important medical decision that could result in potentially, death, and you're doing it on the basis of inductive argument, you would want a very strong inductive argument. If, however, you're, say, buying a bag of chips that's, on sale, and a friend said, yeah, those are pretty good, in that case, if it's a bag of chips for like $1, then taking the risk would be, reasonable, even with relatively low evidence. So there are practical concerns about assessing inductive arguments as well. One very useful type of inductive argument is the analogical argument, also known as the argument by analogy, and sometimes known as the argument from analogy. Now, an analogy, of course, is a comparison between two things, and there are a variety of analogies. There are cases in which we make analogies in order to, say, improve someone's understanding. An explanatory analogy, where a person might explain, say, how the eye works in terms of a camera, or how the heart works in terms of a pump. There are also what are known as rhetorical analogies, where people make comparisons not to enhance understanding, but to make people feel positive or negative about something. We often compare people to people. So, for example, if one is a conservative and one wants to praise somebody, you might say they're like Reagan. Or if someone's a liberal and they want to praise somebody, they might say they're like JFK. Or if someone wants to say that someone is bad, they might say they're like Hitler or Stalin. And there are also sort of like aesthetic analogies where you make comparisons not to make people, feel positive or negative about things, but to make, an aesthetic move. So, for example, when Romeo says, Juliet is the sun, arise, fair sun, and slay the envious moon, he's not saying that she's like a big, sphere of burning gas. He's saying that she's like pretty and stuff. So what about the argument by analogy, or the analogical argument? Well, it's an argument in which one concludes that two things are alike in certain respects because they are alike in other respects. So roughly put, these two things are alike in these ways, so they're alike in this other way that I'm concerned with. Now, analogies are often used in cases where a person already accepts something, that something is, say, morally good. And if you draw an analogy to it and try to show that, if something is like something that's already good, then it's going to be good. or if something is, plausible to show something else is plausible. So they're often used essentially in that way. Now, informally, most people present analogies as just saying these two things are alike in these ways, so they're alike in this other way. But if you want to see the strict form is like this. It has sort of the extended version is 3 premises and a conclusion. Although if you want to make it a little smaller, you can smush together premise 1 and 2. So premise 1, X has properties P, Q, and R. And in this case, X is the first thing or person that you're talking about, and it has certain properties. And P, Q, and R are variables standing for those properties. Now, it need not just be 3. You could be comparing, 10 things, 20, whatever. This is just a, sort of generic template. So the idea is that X has certain qualities. Premise 2, Y, which is the second thing, has properties P, Q, and R. Now again, you could smush them together and say X and Y have properties P, Q, and R, and save yourself a premise. Premise 3, X has properties Z as well. And Z is the property that you're concerned with. It's the property that X has, but you're trying to establish that Y has it as well. And so the conclusion would be that Y has property Z as well. So that would be the structure, formally, of an analogy, comparing two things and saying because they have properties in common, they're alike in this other way that you're concerned with. So how do you tell when you've got a good analogical argument? Well, there are the following standards. The first is this: the number of properties the two things have in common. The more, the better. So the argument is stronger when the two things have more things in common. Now, if you take almost any two things, they'll have a lot of stuff in common. And so the second standard is also rather important, namely the relevance of the shared properties to Z, the quality you're concerned about. So there's a question of how relevant are those qualities that are being shared. And then the third standard is whether X and Y have relevant dissimilarities. Are there things that break the comparison, that break the analogy? Now you may wonder why you would consider things that might break your own analogy if you're making this argument. Well, the reason why is because when you're making your case from the standpoint of trying to achieve truth, which is the goal of philosophy, you'd want to be honest about dissimilarities rather than trying to be deceptive about them. Also, your argument will be hopefully more convincing if you do consider relevant dissimilarities. One advantage to bringing up dissimilarities yourself would be that you're in control of bringing them up, so you can address them, and someone looking at your argument and they see they're probably thinking of potential dissimilarities, and if you brought them up already, they'll say, oh look, they've already addressed these problems. So what would be an example of an argument by analogy? Well, they're commonly used, as you might imagine, in philosophy, and one example would be, say, in ethics. So suppose you wanted to argue that, for example, in ethics, that war is a bad thing. Well, one way you might do this is draw a comparison between war and murder. So, for example, suppose I look at my neighbor's yard and I decide that the grass is in fact greener over there. And I go to Walmart, practicing social distancing, of course, and buy a riding lawnmower, a welder, some metal plates, and a shotgun, a audio player, get a copy of The Ride of the Valkyries, and then I assemble my tank, lawnmower, and then smash across my neighbor's yard, and subdue them, conquer their land, and make it my own. Kill them, kill my neighbors, and take over their property. Well, would that be wrong? And the obvious answer would be, well, yes, that would be pretty evil to do, and it'd be straightforward, murder. It would be clearly wrong. Well, by analogy, war is a similar sort of thing. I mean, generally you have better equipment than a riding lawnmower, and a Walmart shotgun, but the same basic idea. a country, gets its tanks and planes and ships and stuff, crashes across a neighbor's boundary, and kills a lot of people. And so that's analogous. You have people doing killing, so you conclude that war is wrong as well. So how would you assess it? Well, you'd look at the number of properties they have in common, and they would seem to have quite a bit. You'd also look at the relevance to the shared properties. Well, what makes, murdering my neighbor is wrong? Well, the obvious thing would be killing does seem to be plausibly wrong. I mean, a fully developed argument, you'd want to, in ethics, you want to argue that this is wrong. But that seems to be, that murder is wrong seems a safe claim. And war seems to have, that similar quality. Engaging in killing people, that seems to be murder. And so it seemed that if me killing my neighbors would be wrong, then war would be wrong as well. Now next, you'd want to consider whether there are relevant dissimilarities that might break the analogy, that might break the comparison. And one thing to consider would be that war has rules and war is legal. If you declare war properly, you're allowed to go and kill people. And as long as you do the killing within a set of rules, then it's not considered, a war crime. And so you could draw another analogy to assess this analogy to sports. If I'm just running down the street and I run up and just start punching someone, that would be clearly assault. But if I voluntarily get in the ring with somebody and we're boxing, then as long as we stay within the rules of the sport, it's not assault and not morally wrong. And so you could make the argument that my attacking my neighbors would be wrong because I'm breaking, the rules, etc. And war would be okay as long as you're declaring it and following the rules. And then, of course, you could counter back against that as well. So that would be the argument by analogy. A very useful way of arguing. It is, of course, inductive, which means even if you have premises that are all true, the conclusion could still be wrong because you're making a leap. You're saying that because they're alike in these ways, they're alike in this other way. Now, outside of philosophy, arguments by analogy are very useful. A good example would be in medical reasoning. The way that a diagnosis is often done is by analogy. Say, for example, a person goes to the doctor and they've got like a rash and an itch, and the doctor asks them, were you, say, outside, perhaps doing some, lawn work or gardening? And the person says, well, yes. And the doctor thinks about it and recalls back to medical school, seeing examples of poison ivy. And the case of poison ivy that they saw in medical school is very similar to what they're seeing in this rash now. And so they conclude that the person has poison ivy. And that would be like a non-philosophical use of argument by analogy. And if you happen to go in the medical profession and doing diagnoses, a lot of that will be analogy, comparing what your patient is presenting to what you learned in, medical school, nursing, etc. Arguments by analogy are also often used in law. The case of precedent essentially is, roughly this. If you're an attorney arguing for your client, you'd want to find cases like your attorney's case that go the way you want your client's case to go. And essentially you'd say to the judge, this previous case is like my client's case. The ruling was, favorable, therefore you should rule in favor of my client. People also use historical analogies, saying that, particular historical events are like what's happening, say, today, therefore we'll have a similar, occurrence. A good example is, of course, comparing the flu, that happened in the 1900s, that influenza outbreak with the 2020 coronavirus. And so people are drawing historical analogies between them as an argument by analogy. So, for example, some might argue that during that flu pandemic, social distancing, and avoiding people was effective. Therefore, by analogy, with the coronavirus, the same thing would hold as well. So arguments by analogy, very useful, even outside of philosophy.